Welcome to the Project Management Prepcast, helping you prepare for the PMP exam. Here's your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner.
Hello and welcome to the PM Prepcast, where your multimedia player takes you to the PMP exam. I'm your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner, and the topic of this lesson is the determine budget process. The purpose of this process is to aggregate the estimated costs of individual activities to determine the cost baseline. In the previous lesson, we covered estimate costs. These two processes, they are very closely related. And in the case of small projects, one could even say that they are pretty much the same process, because estimate cost and determine budget is done at the very same instance. There are, however, some clear distinctions between them. So in this lesson, we will first distinguish determine budget from estimate costs. We will, of course, cover the different inputs, tools, techniques, and outputs of the process. We introduce new terms and explain other familiar ones within the context of determine budget. For example, we clarify what cost aggregation, funding limit reconciliation, project schedules, and control accounts are all about. We break down budget, cost, and funding concepts. We explain what an S-curve is, and we provide a time-phased perspective of project expenditures and funding. The lesson has two parts, and we split it right in the middle, as you can see here. Overview and inputs are in part 1 right now. Tools and techniques, outputs, and a quick review are in part 2. Let's go. We are in the project cost management knowledge area, which includes the processes involved in planning, estimating, budgeting, financing, funding, managing, and controlling costs so that the project can be completed within the approved budget. The PMBOK guide identifies 4 processes in cost management. It all begins with plan cost management, the process that establishes the policies, procedures, and documentation for planning, managing, expending, and controlling project costs. Then we move on to estimate costs, the process of developing an approximation of the monetary resources needed to complete project activities, or in proper English, how much is it going to cost? Then we move on to determine budget, the process of aggregating the estimated costs of individual activities to work packages to establish an authorized cost baseline. And the translation of what that means, you'll get that in the coming minutes. And finally, there is control costs, the process of monitoring the status of the project to update the project costs and managing changes to the cost baseline. And here is our usual overview into which of the process groups the processes fall. Let's do a little bit of a guessing game here. Do you remember, or can you identify into which process groups determine budget falls? And let me remind you what I said at the opening. I said in many smaller projects, estimate costs and determine budget are almost the same process because you do them at the same time, which of course means that if estimate costs and determining budget can be done at the same time, determining budget also, just like estimate costs, falls into the planning process group. The main concept that you have to understand is that this process is usually so tightly linked to the estimate costs process that it is difficult for many of us to keep them separate. In my own experience, I never had to separately estimate and budget. It was all intertwined. This is especially true if your experience, like mine, is with managing small or medium-sized projects. The PMBOK guide recognizes this fact. However, the processes are still shown separately because each process has a different set of tools and techniques, and each process also has a different focus. In estimate costs, you look at how much does an activity cost? And in determine budget, we are focusing on the when. When will we need the money to be made available? Or better, we are creating a budget that tells us when we will have to have these particular funds available. A project budget includes all approved funds that are needed to complete your project. The determined budget process establishes the cost baseline against which the project performance can be monitored and controlled, and it also determines the funding requirements for your project. One thing that is immediately obvious is the sheer number of inputs and tools and techniques here on our ITTO graphic from the PMBOK guide. We have seen many of these in other lessons. There are a few which are new, and we will focus on these here in this lesson. Notice also that the main outputs are the cost baseline and project funding requirements, but also important are any project document updates required as a result of the determined budget process. And yes, we have so many inputs we couldn't all fit them onto one slide. They are the cost management plan, the scope baseline, the activity cost estimates, the basis of estimates, the project schedule, moving on to the resource calendars, the risk registers, agreements, and finally organizational process assets. Let's take a look at why these are important inputs in helping us determine the budget. The cost management plan is both an input for the estimate cost process as it is here for determine budget. The PMBOK guide defines it as a component of a project or program management plan that describes how cost will be planned, structured, and controlled. So what is contained in the cost management plan that affects the project budget? The cost management plan defines the unit of measurements which should be used. It also defines the level of precision, whether you can round up or have to round down. We need the organizational procedure links to determining the budget. The work breakdown structure, the WBS, provides the framework to enable project cost accounting through the control accounts. And we also have process descriptions. The cost management plan may have specific information on the budgeting process that must be followed for this particular project. Overall, we can see that the cost management plan serves as a critical input to this process as it contains many details relevant to budgeting. Our second input is the scope baseline, which, if you remember, has 3 components. Let's take a look at these one by one and how they relate to the determined budget process. First, we have the scope statement as a major component of the scope baseline. It may contain details on requirements, assumptions, and constraints. In particular, it may describe any funding constraints. For example, if there are any organizational or governmental or contractual obligations which set limits on how much you can spend. For instance, you may not be allowed to exceed your expenditures of 6 million yen per month. You need to know about this constraint so that you can adequately budget or take other actions. This may mean that you have to move activities around so that you don't exceed the monthly maximum limit. Next, the work breakdown structure, the WBS, that is the decomposition of the work to be done on the project. It shows any hierarchy, grouping, or categorization of the work components. This will allow you to budget on a work package basis. And finally, the third component is the WBS dictionary, which will have the supporting details on the components of the project and deliverables and their interrelationships. For example, it would list out deliverables. It also provides a description of work for each WBS component. The information in the work breakdown structure and supporting work breakdown structure dictionary will give you some indication of how and when activities are happening for your budgeting process. In a nutshell, the scope baseline provides the information on what work is to be undertaken within this project. You need to know this in order to be able to determine the budget. We already mentioned that the estimate costs and determine budget processes are very closely tied. As such, the outputs from the estimate cost process then serve as inputs to the determine budget process. The estimate cost process produces activity costs and bases of estimates, and these very same activity cost estimates and bases of estimates then serve as inputs to here determine budget. So in the next set of slides we'll focus on these two inputs to the determine budget process. Let's tackle the activity cost estimates first. These are cost estimates for each activity, which can be in summary or detailed form. To determine budget, the cost estimates for each activity can be aggregated into the cost estimate for each work package. Another way to think about this is that the activity cost estimates provides an indication of how much each project resource or activity is expected to cost. As part of determine budget, the activity cost estimates will be added together on the project to show how much the complete project will cost. Next, there is the basis of estimates, which is also essential for determining the budget. Knowing how estimates are derived and organized informs the budgeting process. It may include the following assumptions. For example, whether some costs were included or excluded in the cost estimate. Constraints, for example, issues or limitations with data used in creating the estimates. The method of estimation on how your numbers were in fact developed. Was it through analogous, parametric, bottom-up estimation, or some other method? The scope of work for the activity in question, so there is clarity around what costs are included in the estimate. And finally, of course, it has to include the range of estimates and an indication regarding your level of confidence in these estimates. The basis of estimates serves to explain, support, and you might even say demystify the activity cost estimates. We want to avoid any misinterpretation of the activity cost estimates when you are determining the budget. Before we take a look at the next input in this process, which is the project schedule, let's take a sneak peek at one of the major outputs, the cost baseline, because the project schedule enables the creation of the cost baseline. The cost baseline is also referred to as the time-phased budget. And in order to represent something over time, well, you need a schedule. So to me, the project schedule should really be the first input, even though the PMBOK guide doesn't list it first. The project schedule is where you keep a handle on dates or when things are supposed to be occurring on the project. So these include plan and finish dates for project activities, for milestones, and for work packages. The project schedule enables the provision of the budget at the right time. In other words, if you know from the schedule that the work will happen in July and you have estimated that it will cost $4,000, well, you have to add $4,000 to the budget in July. Pretty straightforward. You've probably heard me say this one before, but nevertheless, let's take a quick detour and look at the differences between the project management plan and the project schedule. So, from the PMBOK guide, we know that it's not just the project plan, it is the project management plan. This is a formal document. It requires approval, and its focus is on how the project will be planned, executed and controlled. It includes the scope baseline, the schedule baseline, the cost baseline, and other subsidiary plans. This is very different from the project schedule. This serves as your project calendar, and it shows when you are going to do what activity. It's a timeline. It includes linked activities, planned dates, durations, milestones, and resources. There you have the difference. The PMBOK guide defines a resource calendar as a calendar that identifies the working days and shifts on which each specific resource is available. This is the calendar of your individual resource. It contains the details of which resources are assigned to the project. What are their work days? What are their shifts? It tells you the timing of when they are assigned to your project, and it also tells you when resources cannot work on the project. They may be out on vacation, training, or sick leave, so that you shouldn't schedule work for them during that time. The information on the resource calendar can be used to determine resource cost during the project. Next, we have the risk register as an input, which, by the way, is an output from Identify Risks under Project Risk Management. To review, when we looked at the risk register as an input in Estimate costs, we examined the risks for various activities to calculate costs for different contingencies. We considered both negative and positive events. Here, in the Determine Budget process, we are also looking at the risk register, but our focus is towards understanding how to best aggregate the risk response cost and bring them all together and add them up. Our next input are the agreements. Relevant agreements are important because they will tell you how much something will cost. This can include details on costs relating to products, services, and results. And this is reflected also in the PMBOK guide definition, which is any document or communication that defines the initial intentions of a project. This can be taking the form of a contract, memorandum of understanding, letters of agreement, verbal agreement, email, etc. And if you've ever seen those, there's always a section that talks about cost in such an agreement. The agreements may also provide other detail, such as when payment is due for all the items that you may be purchasing on your project. That is important information because we are, after all, creating a time-phased budget, and we have to know when payment is due. Our final input are the organizational process assets. Here it's worth noting that companies themselves have a certain approach to how they determine a budget. You'll know that if you've done some budgeting in various companies. And this will be documented and defined in the organizational process assets. To be specific, it's defined in policies, procedures, and guidelines, and we have already referred to policies and procedures and guidelines when we discussed estimate costs. There is a difference here. Whereas we were naturally focused on organizational process assets relevant to estimating costs in that process when we looked at the estimate costs process. Now we are in Determine Budget, so we are interested in the specific policies, procedures, and guidelines that will inform us about cost budgeting. Note that these policies, procedures, and guidelines, they may be both formal and informal. Other organizational process assets to consider are the cost budgeting tools. Some companies may have expensive financial packages for cost budgeting, but many use just simple spreadsheet applications for this purpose. And there are also reporting methods. Your organization may specify reporting formats and have requirements around when and how and to whom a budget has to be provided. And we have now reached the end of part 1 of this lesson, so we have to part. Justine, what do we say?
Bye for now.
Until next time.